Before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing deep dives into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more, and comment below with what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. Your support helps us continue making peaceful, informative content you can fall asleep to. Now, let's take a quiet step back into the world that gave rise to modern life, where steam, coal, and innovation transformed the world forever. To truly understand the significance of the Industrial Revolution, we must first immerse ourselves in the world as it existed before steam, factories, and mechanized power, when life followed the slow and steady rhythms of nature, and nearly every necessity was crafted by hand. This was a world of villages, fields, and forests. A world where time was measured not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun. Where seasons dictated not just weather, but survival. When to sow, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter. People lived in close-knit communities, their lives tied intimately to the land and to one another. In 1700s, Europe, and especially in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution would first take root, over 80% of the population lived in rural areas. Cities existed, of course, London, Paris, Edinburgh, but they were relatively small by modern standards, and often centres of trade or governance rather than production. Most people were farmers, and most work was done with simple hand tools. Oxen ploughed the fields, scythes cut the grain. Looms were powered by muscle, not motors. The domestic system, also known as cottage industry, was the dominant method of producing goods. A merchant might bring raw wool to a household. The family would spin it into yarn, weave it into cloth, and hand it back. Each step took time, and the work was often done during the long, dark months of winter by the light of a candle or hearth fire. Work and life were interwoven. Children, parents, and grandparents might all contribute. There was no separation between home and labor, no factory bell to ring the start and end of a shift. Life was hard, yes, but it was consistent. For many, it was the only life they had ever known. Transportation was slow and expensive. Most roads were rutted dirt tracks, impassable in rain or snow. A horse-drawn wagon might travel only 15 to 20 miles a day. Goods moved primarily by river or canal, but these routes were limited. Moving bulk materials, coal, iron, timber, over land was difficult. This limited industrial growth, since resources often lay far from markets or ports. Energy was another constraint. Wood was the primary fuel, used for heating homes and cooking food. But deforestation was a growing problem. In some areas, timber was scarce, and charcoal, made from burned wood, was used to fuel forges and early metalworking. But charcoal was inefficient. The supply could not keep pace with demand. Coal was known, but underutilized. Mining was dangerous and labor-intensive. Early shafts flooded easily, and without proper pumps, deeper coal seams remained out of reach. Agriculture, meanwhile, had been improving, but slowly. Innovations like the three-field crop rotation system allowed for better soil usage. New tools like seed drills, championed by figures like Jethro Tull in Britain, made planting more efficient. Selective breeding of livestock improved meat and dairy yields. These changes gradually increased food supply, which in turn supported population growth. And population growth was crucial. As more people survived infancy and lived longer lives, demand for goods rose. More hands were available to work. Cities began to swell. Incomes, while still low, slowly improved. The structure of society was beginning to shift. At the same time, political and intellectual developments laid the groundwork for industrialization. The Enlightenment encouraged critical thinking, experimentation, and innovation. Scientific societies published findings, and inventors tinkered with machines in workshops and barns. The Protestant work ethic, emphasizing discipline, thrift, and hard work, encouraged entrepreneurial risk-taking, especially in places like England and the Netherlands. Then there were the economic changes. Trade had expanded. Colonial empires brought in sugar, cotton, tea, and tobacco. Banking systems had evolved, and credit was more widely available. The idea of investment, of funding new ventures with the hope of future profit, became more mainstream. Joint stock companies, stock exchanges, and early forms of insurance created financial ecosystems ready to support industrial growth. Legal systems in Britain offered patent protection, allowing inventors to safeguard their ideas. Property rights were enforced, and the rule of law made business more secure. All of this created a fertile environment for change. But it was still a world waiting for a spark. In most homes, light came from tallow candles or oil lamps. Water was drawn from wells or streams. Waste was disposed of in cesspits or thrown into the street. Disease was common. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy in many regions hovered between 35 and 40 years. It was a world of labor, subsistence, and survival. And yet, this world was about to be transformed, not by a single event, but by a cascade of innovations, discoveries, and social shifts. The rise of machinery would not only alter how goods were made, but how people lived, worked, moved, and even thought. As we transition from the quiet countryside into the roar of the machine age, it's important to remember the baseline: a world lit by fire, moved by muscle, and shaped by tradition. Because once the gears began to turn, there would be no going back. The story of the Industrial Revolution truly begins not with iron or steam, but with cloth. Specifically, the need to spin yarn and weave fabric faster than ever before. Of all the industries to be transformed first, it was textiles that ignited the fire of mechanization. In 18th century Britain, demand for cloth was booming. A growing population, expanding colonial trade, and rising middle classes meant that more people wanted cotton clothing. Cotton was softer, lighter, and easier to clean than wool or linen. But cotton had to be imported, often from India, or the American colonies. And turning raw cotton into finished cloth was time-consuming. Enter the flying shuttle. Invented by John Kay in 1733, it revolutionized weaving by allowing a single weaver to operate a loom more efficiently. Previously, weaving wide fabric required 2 people. Now, one could do the work of 2, doubling output almost overnight. But while weaving sped up, spinning, turning raw cotton into thread, remained a bottleneck. That bottleneck wouldn't last long. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, a multi-spindle spinning frame that allowed one worker to spin several threads at once. Not long after, Richard Arkwright developed the water frame, which used water power to drive spinning machines, laying the groundwork for the first true factories. Then came Samuel Crompton and the spinning mule in 1779, a hybrid of the spinning jenny and the water frame. It could produce finer, stronger thread than ever before. Meanwhile, Edmund Cartwright patented the power loom in the 1780s, automating the weaving process entirely. These machines didn't just increase speed, they changed everything. Cottage industry could no longer compete. Production began to centralize. Entrepreneurs built large buildings to house the machines and hired workers to operate them. These were the first textile mills, and they required something new: power. Water wheels were the earliest solution. Many mills were built alongside rivers, where flowing water could drive gears and belts. But water had limits. It wasn't always reliable. It froze in winter and dried in drought. That's when the true engine of the Industrial Revolution emerged: steam. In the late 1600s, inventor Thomas Savery created an early steam pump to remove water from coal mines. His design was inefficient, but it sparked interest. Then came Thomas Newcomen, who improved upon Savery's idea with an atmospheric steam engine. The real breakthrough came in the 1760s, when James Watt, a Scottish engineer, made major enhancements to the steam engine. He added a separate condenser, making it far more efficient. Watt's engine wasn't just for pumping water anymore. It could power machines, drive wheels, and change the world. And it did. Steam engines were soon used to power spinning mules, looms, and presses. Factories no longer had to rely on rivers. They could be built in cities, near workers, and transportation hubs. This was a turning point. From water to steam, from countryside to urban center, from household craft to industrial production. With this shift came the rise of the factory system. Workers now labored long hours in noisy, crowded buildings. The rhythm of the sun was replaced by the clock. Work was divided into tasks, each person responsible for one step of the process. It was efficient, but it was also dehumanizing. Conditions were often poor. Factories were hot, dusty, and dangerous. Children were employed because they could crawl under machines or operate small parts. Accidents were common. Yet wages, though low, offered stability, and in rural areas suffering from unemployment or enclosure, factory work became a lifeline. Alongside cotton mills, the demand for coal surged. Steam engines needed fuel, and coal mining expanded rapidly. Entire regions, like Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands, became industrial powerhouses. Small towns exploded into cities. Pollution darkened the skies, and rivers ran black with dye. But there was also opportunity. Industrialists grew rich. Inventors became famous. New social classes emerged. A growing middle class of managers, clerks, and entrepreneurs. The economy began to shift from land-based wealth to industrial capital. The transformation was just beginning, but it all started here, with thread, with cloth, with simple machines made complex. From the humble spinning wheel to the roaring factory floor, textiles were the first domino. And once they fell, the rest followed. With the textile industry paving the way, the gears of the Industrial Revolution began to spin faster. And at the heart of this acceleration was energy. While water had powered the early mills, it was steam and the fuels that fed it that truly transformed the world. To feed the insatiable hunger of machines, the Industrial Revolution turned underground. The demand for coal exploded. It burned hotter than wood and was essential not only for steam engines, but for smelting iron, another cornerstone of the new industrial age. Coal mines dotted the landscape, especially in regions like South Wales, Yorkshire, and Lanarkshire in Scotland. In these dark, narrow shafts, men, women, and even children laboured for hours in dangerous conditions. They used picks, shovels, and rudimentary carts to extract the black fuel that powered everything from textile mills to locomotives. But mining had a persistent problem: flooding. Water seeped into the earth, pooling in shafts, threatening collapse. This is where steam technology first found its purpose. Newcomen's steam engine, introduced in 1712, was designed specifically to pump water from mines. It worked, though slowly. It wasn't until James Watt's refinements, particularly the addition of a separate condenser, that steam power became practical, portable, and powerful. Soon, steam engines were adapted beyond mining. They turned water wheels, powered mills, and began replacing manual labour. Their engines pulsed at the centre of new factories, belching smoke from towering chimneys and spinning wheels deep into the night. But steam alone wasn't enough. These machines needed to be made of something strong, something that could withstand pressure, heat, and constant motion. That something was iron. Iron had been used for centuries, but the Industrial Revolution demanded better, cheaper, and more abundant iron. The traditional charcoal smelting method couldn't meet the demand. In 1709, Abraham Darby, working in Coal Brookdale, Shropshire, made a breakthrough. He used coke, a coal derivative, to smelt iron instead of charcoal. Coke was easier to produce and more plentiful. This revolutionized the iron industry. Soon, massive blast furnaces turned out tons of iron. Bridges, railways, tools, and engines all demanded it. In 1779, the world's first cast iron bridge was built, aptly named the Iron Bridge, spanning the River Severn in England. It became a symbol of the new age. Then came further innovations. In the 1780s, Henry Cort developed the puddling process, which allowed for the mass production of malleable wrought iron. This iron could be shaped and stretched, ideal for structural purposes. Iron was no longer just a material, it was an industry. Ironworks became the heart of towns and cities. They glowed red with molten metal, the air thick with ash and smoke. Furnaces ran day and night. Workers braved searing heat to pour, hammer, and mold the very bones of the industrial world. And iron was not just used for tools, it was used for transport. Enter the railway. In 1804, Richard Trevithick built the first full-scale working railway steam locomotive. His design was followed by further advancements from engineers like George Stephenson, whose famous locomotive, the Rocket, became a symbol of speed and progress. Railroads changed everything. Goods could now be transported rapidly across long distances. Coal, iron, textiles, and food moved from countryside to city and back again. Costs dropped, markets expanded, time shrank. By mid-century, railways crisscrossed Britain and soon spread across Europe and North America. Towns that once took days to reach by wagon could now be accessed in hours. The world felt smaller, faster, more connected. The triumvirate of steam, coal, and iron had created a new ecosystem, one of speed, scale, and endless motion. Industry no longer rested at the mercy of rivers or seasons. It moved to the beat of pistons, the hiss of steam, and the rumble of trains. But this power came at a cost. Coal mining devastated landscapes. Iron foundries polluted rivers and skies. Steam engines, while revolutionary, filled the air with soot. Diseases spread in cities built too fast to manage sanitation. Workers, once bound to fields, now became part of machines, timed, scheduled, replaceable. Still, there was no turning back. The Industrial Revolution was no longer an experiment. It was a force, relentless, ambitious, and global. By the early 1800s, the industrial landscape had been reshaped, physically, economically, and culturally. The heart of this transformation beat strongest where steam, iron, and coal came together in a powerful interlocking system. Coal fields became the new centres of activity. In Britain, places like Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield exploded in growth. Where once there had been small towns or agricultural villages, there now stood dense clusters of factories, smokestacks, rail yards, and tenements. Manchester, in particular, earned the nickname Cottonopolis, fueled by imported cotton from America and India, powered by local coal and serviced by steam engines and iron machinery. It became the industrial capital of Britain. It was here that one could truly witness the collision of the old and the new. Medieval churches standing beside clattering mills and horse-drawn carts pulling alongside steam-powered locomotives. As industry scaled, so too did its machinery. Early steam engines were massive and stationary, often housed in dedicated engine rooms. But continual innovation brought refinements in efficiency, portability, and strength. Engineers like Trevithick, Stephenson, and Brunel pushed the boundaries of what steam could power. The introduction of the high-pressure steam engine meant machines could be made smaller, lighter, and more mobile. This paved the way for not just railroads, but steamships, floating factories that revolutionized oceanic transport. The marriage of iron hulls and steam engines made ships faster, more reliable, and capable of carrying larger cargo. The first steamship to cross the Atlantic, the SS Savannah, did so in 1819, though still partially powered by sails. By mid-century, steamships had become the dominant force on international trade routes. Iron was no longer a luxury or a specialty. It became a foundation. It built the infrastructure of modern life: bridges, viaducts, cranes, building frames, tools, rails, machines. It symbolized strength, permanence, and progress. In some cities, even architecture took on an industrial aesthetic. Iron facades, wrought railings, skeletal trusses. Yet with all this innovation came new challenges of scale. Iron production required vast quantities of limestone and coal, spurring environmental degradation. Forests were cut down for rail ties and mine supports. Quarries scarred the countryside. Rivers became conduits not just for water, but for waste. Industrial cities, fed by coal and iron, suffered the consequences. Skies darkened with smog. Chimneys spewed smoke into homes and streets. Respiratory illnesses became common. Rivers that once teemed with fish now stank with industrial runoff. The public was divided. Some celebrated these marvels of engineering as proof of human progress. Others mourned the loss of nature, community, and silence. Writers and philosophers of the time, like William Blake, warned of dark satanic mills. Artists painted landscapes of decay and mechanical sprawl. And still, engineers pressed on, perfecting techniques, expanding reach, and laying iron veins across continents. Even architecture was transformed. Factories, mills, and train stations were built on a monumental scale. Consider St. Pancras Station in London, or the Crystal Palace, designed by Joseph Paxton for the Great Exhibition of 1851. These structures celebrated industrial materials, glass, iron, and steel, not just for utility, but for aesthetic expression. By the middle of the 19th century, Steam engines powered not just machines, but economies. They gave birth to schedules, timetables, and the very idea of standardized time zones, first introduced by railway companies to coordinate trains across vast distances. The world was no longer seasonal and circular. It had become linear, fast, and mechanical. And behind this momentum stood the twin engines of iron and coal, driven by steam. The Industrial Revolution, once a ripple in the textile industry, had become a global tide, and it was still rising. With steam, coal, and iron laying the foundation, a new structure began to dominate both the physical and social landscape of the 19th century: the factory. More than a building, the factory became a symbol of progress, of power, and of profound transformation. Before industrialization, most work was done at home or in small workshops, with labor centered around daylight hours and flexible rhythms. But the factory changed all that. It centralized production under one roof, where machines ran continuously, powered by steam and overseen by foremen. This new workplace brought with it a new concept: clock time. Time was no longer ruled by the sun or the season, but by bells, shifts, and schedules. Workers punched in and out. Their lives began to orbit around machines that didn't tire, didn't pause, and demanded human attendance from dawn until dark, and often longer. Days stretched to 12 or even 16 hours, 6 days a week. Sundays were often the only day of rest. Inside, the environment was often harsh: deafening noise from spinning gears and looms, dense air filled with lint or coal dust, dangerous moving parts with little protection. The division of labor became the norm. Instead of crafting a full product, each worker performed one repetitive task. This system, first theorized by thinkers like Adam Smith, maximized efficiency, but also minimized creativity and satisfaction. Workers became cogs in a greater machine. Factories also altered the composition of the workforce. Entire families worked in the same mill. Parents, teenagers, and even small children. In textile mills, children as young as 5 operated machinery, crawled under looms, and worked long hours with minimal pay. The idea of childhood as a protected time of learning and play had not yet taken root. Pay was low, jobs were insecure, injuries were common, illnesses like phossy jaw, caused by phosphorus in match factories, or lung disease from coal dust, were part of industrial life. Yet, for all its hardship, factory work offered something many rural families needed: steady wages. Unlike agriculture, which could be wiped out by drought or blight, factory work paid predictably. It attracted migrants from countryside to city, and soon, Britain and other industrial nations saw their urban populations swell. Cities like Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow, and Liverpool transformed almost overnight. Rows of factory housing, known as terraced homes, were built rapidly. These were often cramped, lacking running water or sanitation. Streets filled with mud, waste, and the sound of industry. The industrial city became a paradox, a place of opportunity and squalor, wealth and misery, advancement and exploitation. Grand train stations and civic buildings rose in the city centre, while workers crowded into slums nearby. Social divides grew sharper, and yet people adapted. They formed communities, trade networks, and new identities. The working class, once a loose concept, became a recognizable force, with shared experiences, needs, and eventually demands. In response to dangerous conditions and low pay, early labor movements emerged. Workers began to organize. They held strikes, formed unions, and lobbied for rights. Figures like Robert Owen, a factory owner turned reformer, argued for improved conditions and even established model communities like New Lanark, where workers received education, fair wages, and decent housing. Governments, initially hands-off, began to intervene. The Factory Acts of the early 19th century in Britain introduced limits on child labour, reduced working hours, and mandated some basic safety standards. These were early, often inadequate steps, but they marked a shift toward regulation. Education slowly expanded. Literacy rates rose as governments and philanthropists recognized the importance of teaching the next generation. Night schools were established for adult workers. Libraries were built in cities. Meanwhile, cities evolved. The invention of gaslighting made streets safer and extended working hours. Later, the introduction of sewers and clean water systems dramatically improved public health. Urban planning was still in its infancy, but the groundwork for modern cities was being laid. Despite the grim realities, the factory age also fostered innovation in every corner of life. Mass production lowered the cost of goods, making items like soap, textiles, and utensils more affordable to the average person. Department stores, catalogues, and regular wages created the beginnings of consumer culture. Work itself became a defining identity. For many, a job in a factory, even a dangerous one, offered a place in the modern world, a path to survival, and sometimes a modest degree of upward mobility. And at the center of it all was the factory, a place where noise, smoke, and labor turned raw materials into the very fabric of modern life. One of the most visible and transformative effects of the Industrial Revolution was the dramatic overhaul of how people and goods moved. Before this era, transportation was painfully slow, unreliable, and costly. The journey between cities could take days or even weeks. Carts slogged through muddy roads, horses tired easily, most people lived and died within a day's walk of their birthplace. But with the rise of industry came the urgent need for better ways to move coal, iron, textiles, food, and people. And so, a transportation revolution began, first with canals, and then with the unstoppable rise of the railways. The canal age began in earnest during the mid-18th century. Britain, with its damp, flat regions, was particularly suited for canal building. These artificial waterways allowed for the smooth movement of heavy goods, especially coal, which was crucial for powering the early stages of industry. One of the first major successes was the Bridgewater Canal, opened in 1761, which connected coal mines in Worsley to the growing city of Manchester. By drastically reducing the cost of coal transport, it lowered prices and boosted industrial output. Soon, a network of canals began to web across England, linking factories to markets and ports. Locks, aqueducts, and towpaths became standard features in the countryside. Canals offered a smoother and safer alternative to bumpy roads, but they had limits. They were expensive to build, slow to travel, and relied on horses to pull barges. In regions where water was scarce or terrain was rough, canals were simply not viable. Enter the railway. While wooden wagonways and mining tracks had existed for centuries, it wasn't until the development of the steam locomotive that the true potential of rail was realized. The pivotal moment came in 1825, when George Stephenson's Locomotion No. 1 carried passengers and freight on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. This was followed by the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, widely considered the first modern railway line. It was a revelation. Trains moved faster than anything previously imagined, 20, 30, even 50 miles per hour. What once took a week by foot or cart could now be done in a single day or less. Goods arrived fresher. Trade became faster. Communication sped up. The very perception of distance began to change. Railways multiplied quickly. By the mid-19th century, thousands of miles of track crisscrossed Britain, Germany, France, and the United States. Towns along railway lines flourished. New cities sprang up. Villages were connected in ways never before possible. The effects were profound. Economically, railways made the movement of goods vastly cheaper and more efficient. Factories could ship products across the country or to coastal ports with ease. Raw materials arrived faster and in greater quantities. Regional specializations emerged. Steel from Sheffield, cotton from Manchester, pottery from Stoke-on-Trent. Socially, the rails allowed for greater mobility. People travelled for work, leisure, and education. Tourism was born. Seaside towns like Brighton and Blackpool became accessible to the working and middle classes. Newspapers and mail circulated rapidly, knitting distant regions into a single, connected society. Culturally, railways reshaped time itself, with trains running on strict timetables. A need arose for standardized time zones. Prior to this, each town kept its own local time. But rail companies needed coordination. Thus, Greenwich Mean Time became the standard in Britain, and similar systems emerged globally. The railways also created massive new industries. Iron, steel, coal, engineering, construction, all expanded to support the building and operation of trains. Thousands of people were employed as navvies, railroad labourers, drivers, ticket sellers, mechanics, and more. And they changed the landscape. Hills were cut, tunnels bored, bridges spanned valleys, and massive train stations were built in cities. Grand structures, like London's King's Cross, Paris's Gare du Nord, and New York's Grand Central, became symbols of progress and modernity. Meanwhile, the steamship quietly revolutionized global trade. Just as railways connected regions, steamships connected continents. By the 1840s and 1850s, paddle steamers and later screw-driven ships carried goods and passengers across the Atlantic and around the world. The combination of rail and steamship shrank the planet. For the first time in history, a business person in Manchester could send goods to India and get a reply within weeks. Colonies became more accessible. Migration soared. Millions of people left Europe for the Americas, Australia, and beyond, often traveling by rail to a port, then by ship to a new life. But progress came with cost. Railroads required enormous capital. Land was seized. Traditional rural life was disrupted. Forests and fields gave way to iron tracks. Accidents, though less frequent than by carriage, were more catastrophic. Critics feared the psychological effects of speed and noise. Some worried that the soul could not travel as fast as the body. Still, the world had changed. Transportation was no longer a barrier. It was an engine of possibility, and with faster movement came faster change. New ideas, new products, new expectations. The Industrial Revolution had found its legs, and it was running full speed ahead. The transformation of transportation wasn't merely about speed and distance. It reshaped the very fabric of society. With the coming of the railway and the steamship, how people lived, where they worked, what they ate, and how they saw the world would change forever. One of the most immediate effects was the expansion of labour markets. People were no longer tied to their birthplace for work. A young man in rural Lancashire could now travel to Manchester in a matter of hours, find employment in a factory, and send money back home. This mobility offered opportunities, but also dislocation. Families were separated. Rural communities declined as younger generations left for industrial centres. In urban areas, the influx of workers created diverse, bustling neighbourhoods, each shaped by the migration of people from nearby towns and increasingly from other countries. Cities became melting pots. Languages, customs, and foodways mingled. new dialects formed. This urban dynamism would become a hallmark of the industrial world. The railways also democratized access to goods. Farmers in Scotland could now sell dairy in London, fish from coastal villages, reached inland markets while still fresh. Local shortages could be offset by distant surpluses. A truly national economy began to form, interconnected, responsive, and resilient. In a quieter, more personal way, railways began to change family life. Workers who previously lived far from home could now visit on weekends. Leisure trips became a possibility, not just for the wealthy, but for shopkeepers, clerks, and skilled labourers. The idea of the weekend excursion, of vacation time, was born on the rails. Meanwhile, steamships broadened the horizon even further. Transatlantic migration surged. Between 1815 and 1914, over 30 million Europeans emigrated to the Americas, many aboard steamships. They brought with them skills, cultures, and dreams. The journey, which once took months under sail, could now be completed in a matter of weeks or even days. Shipping also transformed global trade. British textiles flowed into India and China. Spices, tea, rubber, and opium returned to Europe. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, shortened the sea route between Europe and Asia, tightening colonial control and accelerating economic exchange. But while the engine of global movement roared forward, not all were passengers by choice. Transportation became a tool of empire. Colonial powers used railways to extract resources, not just to connect peoples. In India, railroads were laid not primarily for Indian mobility, but to move cotton, tea, and soldiers across the subcontinent. In Africa, rail lines often ran from mines to ports, not between cities. Steamships carried not only goods, but also soldiers, administrators, and missionaries, projecting power across oceans. In this sense, industrial transportation was not neutral. It carried both the promise of connection and the reality of control. It unified nations, but also divided empires. It sped up progress, but also entrenched inequality. Yet, amid the tension, the cultural imagination was sparked. Writers described the thrill of movement. Jules Verne's globe-trotting adventures, Dickens's observations of train life, and the poetry of new landscapes seen from a window in motion. Time and space were no longer fixed. They were traversable. Even art changed. Painters tried to capture motion, blur, and speed. Architects designed grand rail stations with iron roofs and glass facades that rivaled cathedrals. Public clocks became essential, timetables sacred. The railway became not just a means of travel, but a symbol of modern life. Every rumble of a train or hiss of a steamship engine reinforced a new reality. The world was in motion, and with it, the Industrial Revolution marched on, faster, further, and with greater reach than ever before. As the smoke of industry thickened and rail lines stitched the land together, A new and distinct feature of human civilization rose alongside the machine: the industrial city. It was not born in a single stroke, nor confined to one country, but it emerged with such scale and speed that it fundamentally redefined how millions of people lived, worked, and related to one another. At first glance, the industrial city was a place of energy and promise. It offered jobs, wages, and the possibility of advancement, especially to those fleeing the limitations of rural life. By the mid-19th century, cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and London in Britain, Lille in France, and Essen in Germany swelled with people. Once modest towns now roared with the sound of progress. Brick chimneys rose like artificial trees. Mills and factories lined riversides, and iron bridges arched across canals and railways. From afar, these cities glowed with the fires of industry. But up close, the experience was far more complex and often grim. Housing was among the most pressing issues. As workers poured into cities, developers threw up rows of cheap, quickly built terraced housing. These structures, while efficient in layout, were densely packed and lacked basic sanitation. Often, entire families crowded into a single room. Toilets were shared between dozens. Water came from communal pumps. There was little ventilation, and windows opened to alleys filled with refuse. Disease thrived in these conditions. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis were regular occurrences. Life expectancy in the poorest districts dropped dramatically. Children exposed to industrial pollutants and malnutrition often did not survive to adulthood. The working environment was similarly harsh. Factories ran from early morning into the night, driven by the relentless hunger of machines. Men, women, and children labored side by side, often for 12 to 16 hours a day. Breaks were minimal. Injuries were frequent. Machine belts caught sleeves and hair. Iron tongs slipped. Fires broke out. Few regulations existed to protect workers. Those who protested faced dismissal. In many factories, fines were imposed for arriving late, talking, or even taking unscheduled bathroom breaks. Outside the workplace, life remained tethered to survival. There were no pensions, health care, or social safety nets. A worker who fell ill could lose their job, and with it, their home. Poor relief systems, if available, were deeply stigmatized. Charity might offer a meal or a bed, but little else. As a result, entire neighborhoods lived in a constant state of economic precarity. Poverty was not just a risk, it was a daily reality. Yet within this struggle, resilience bloomed. Communities formed mutual aid societies and cooperatives. They pooled money to cover funerals, medical care, or temporary unemployment. Churches and local leaders organized soup kitchens, literacy classes, and public lectures. The first glimmers of working-class culture began to shine, rooted in shared experience, solidarity, and a growing sense of political identity. At the same time, the city became a site of reform and activism. Horrified by the conditions of the urban poor, social reformers began to push for change. Figures like Edwin Chadwick documented the squalor of slums and linked public health to sanitation. His work contributed to the Public Health Act of 1848, which aimed to clean water supplies, improve drainage, and manage waste disposal. Though slow and uneven, such reforms laid the foundation for modern urban planning. Education was another battleground. Industrialists and reformers alike began to recognize the value of an educated workforce. Sunday schools taught children to read and write. Eventually, state-supported elementary education was introduced, giving working-class children access to learning, though often in crowded classrooms with limited resources. Still, it marked a turning point. The factory was no longer the only path. In the wealthier districts of the city, the contrast was stark. The middle and upper classes lived in detached homes with gardens, gas lighting, and indoor plumbing. They rode horse-drawn carriages through wide boulevards, attended opera performances, and read newspapers by firelight. For them, the industrial city was a place of comfort and culture, but even they could not escape the broader consequences of urbanization. Smoke from factories darkened the skies above every neighborhood. The stench of poorly managed waste crossed class lines. Diseases, once confined to the slums, sometimes crept into wealthier homes. Thus, the industrial city was not just a place. It was a paradox. It produced both progress and pollution, opportunity and oppression, innovation and inequality. It revealed the power of human ingenuity, but also the cost when that power went unchecked. Over time, public pressure grew. Reformers published pamphlets. Artists painted scenes of suffering. Writers like Charles Dickens portrayed urban misery with brutal honesty. Policymakers slowly began to listen. Urban parks were created. Public baths were established. Clean water was piped into homes. Sewer systems were expanded. The city, once a symbol of industrial chaos, began to evolve into something more livable. Still, for the average worker, life remained hard. And yet, through all the smoke and clamor, the industrial city endured, pulsing with the hope that tomorrow might be better, that progress could serve people as well as machines. Beneath the towering chimneys and humming machinery of the industrial city, a quiet force was gathering momentum, one not made of coal or iron, but of people. In the face of relentless labor, dangerous conditions, and stark inequality, the working class began to awaken, not just to their suffering, but to their collective power. Out of the soot and smoke of urban life rose a new voice, the voice of organized labor. The early stages of industrialization offered workers few protections. They were at the mercy of their employers, dismissed without cause, replaced without notice, and paid at the discretion of factory owners. With no legal right to organize, workers who protested risked blacklisting or worse. And yet, they organized anyway, first in secret, then in small local groups, and eventually in mass movements that would shape the politics of the industrial world. One of the earliest forms of resistance was the Luddite movement, which emerged in the 1810s. Named after the possibly fictional figure Ned Ludd, these workers, primarily textile artisans, smashed machines that they believed were taking their jobs and devaluing their skills. Though often portrayed as anti-technology, the Luddites were in fact protesting the social and economic upheaval brought by unchecked mechanization. Their message was clear. Progress without justice would not be welcomed quietly. By the 1830s and 1840s, a more organized and political movement began to take hold, Chartism. Named after the People's Charter of 1838, this movement sought to expand political rights for working-class men. Its demands included universal male suffrage, secret ballots, equal electoral districts, and payment for members of parliament. Though the Chartists failed to achieve their goals immediately, they laid the groundwork for future democratic reforms and brought working-class issues into the national conversation. At the same time, workers began forming trade unions, first in defiance of the law, then within a changing legal framework. These unions, often based around specific trades or industries, gave workers a voice in negotiations, a structure for solidarity, and a means to strike when demands were not met. Through collective bargaining, workers began to win modest gains, shorter working hours, safer conditions, better pay. Strikes, though risky, became a powerful tool. Employers, once omnipotent, now had to contend with the united front of labor. The rise of labor organizations was matched by the emergence of working-class consciousness, a shared identity rooted not in geography or tradition, but in labor itself. Workers came to see themselves as part of a class with common interests, struggles, and aspirations. This awareness was often forged in the hardships of industrial life, on the factory floor, in tenement housing, or on the picket line. Literature and newspapers helped spread this consciousness. Radical pamphlets circulated in city streets. Public lectures drew crowds of workers eager to hear speakers challenge the status quo. Socialist ideas began to take hold, particularly those of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who analyzed the capitalist system as inherently exploitative and called for the working class to seize control of the means of production. Engels, who lived in industrial Manchester, documented the horrors of the working class experience in The Condition of the Working Class in England, a searing indictment of industrial capitalism. Yet not all responses were revolutionary. Many workers sought incremental change through reform, education, and political participation. Cooperative societies were established, allowing workers to pool resources and buy goods at fair prices. Friendly societies offered insurance and support in times of illness or unemployment. Political reformers pushed for voting rights, labor protections, and social legislation. The impact of these movements was profound. Over time, laws were passed to limit child labor, regulate working hours, and establish safety standards. By the late 19th century, many industrialized nations had introduced compulsory education, public health measures, and rudimentary welfare programs, often as a direct response to pressure from organized labor and public advocacy. Meanwhile, the cities themselves began to change in response to the demands of their residents. Urban planning gained traction. Parks were laid out as lungs for the industrial city. Public libraries and museums opened, offering knowledge and culture to the masses. Public transportation systems, omnibuses, trams, and eventually subways, allowed workers to live further from the factory and breathe cleaner. Air. This was a new kind of urban life, still harsh, still unequal, but slowly being shaped by the people who lived it. The factory, once a symbol of dominance, became a site of contestation. The city, once chaotic and unplanned, began to reflect the values of community and justice. The working class, once silenced and scattered, found its voice, and it would not be silenced again. While the Industrial Revolution reshaped cities, labor, and economies, its pulse beat just as strongly in the quiet hum of laboratories, the clatter of workshops, and the inked margins of engineering notebooks. At its core, this era was as much an intellectual revolution as it was a mechanical one. It was an age when science met enterprise, and curiosity found form in invention. The line between scientist and inventor blurred. Thinkers no longer operated in isolation, but as part of a wider culture that valued experimentation, application, and improvement. Tinkering was no longer just a hobby, it was a profession. Engineering became a respected field. Patents became a pathway to fortune, and across Britain, France, Germany, and America, inventors became household names. At the center of this innovation wave stood James Watt, whose steam engine did more than pump water. It powered factories, locomotives, and progress itself. But Watt did not act alone. His partnership with Matthew Boulton, a savvy businessman, demonstrated the new synergy between science and capital. Boulton and Watt's Soho foundry in Birmingham became not just a manufacturing center, but a hub of innovation, a place where ideas were forged into reality. This fusion of theory and practice was visible everywhere. In metallurgy, new techniques improved the quality and availability of iron. In chemistry, advancements led to the creation of synthetic dyes, fertilizers, and soaps. The German chemist Justus von Liebig, for instance, revolutionized agriculture with his work on soil nutrients, laying the foundation for modern agronomy. Such discoveries didn't remain academic, they were swiftly commercialized, impacting daily life. Communication was transformed in astonishing ways. In 1837, Samuel Morse developed the telegraph, enabling messages to travel across wires at unprecedented speed. The famous phrase, "What hath God wrought?" sent between Washington and Baltimore, marked a new era. Within decades, telegraph lines spanned continents and oceans, connecting cities and empires in a web of near instantaneous communication. What once took weeks by horse or ship could now be conveyed in moments. Diplomacy, trade, and journalism changed forever. Alongside communication, transportation technology surged ahead. Engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel dreamed bigger than ever before, building massive steamships like the Great Eastern, designing revolutionary suspension bridges, and digging vast tunnels beneath rivers. Their projects were monuments not only to ambition, but to a growing mastery over materials and design. These were not just functional structures, they were statements, asserting that no obstacle, be it river, mountain, or ocean, was beyond human ingenuity. The domestic sphere also saw the touch of innovation. Though the benefits of industrialization came slowly to many households, by the mid to late 19th century, new products began to transform everyday life. The sewing machine perfected by Isaac Singer sped up clothing production. Gas lighting extended the day. Plumbing improved sanitation. And in wealthier homes, early versions of appliances, ice boxes, washing ringers, mechanical fans, began to appear. In the medical field, advances were no less significant. The 19th century witnessed the birth of modern medicine. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine had laid the groundwork for immunology. Later, Louis Pasteur developed germ theory, challenging centuries of misunderstanding about disease. With it came the invention of pasteurization, revolutionizing food safety. Joseph Lister, inspired by Pasteur, introduced antiseptics in surgery, drastically reducing infection and saving countless lives. These breakthroughs did more than extend life. They reshaped attitudes toward health, hygiene, and care. Hospitals began to emphasize cleanliness. Cities invested in sanitation infrastructure. Public health, once an afterthought, became a civic priority. Science was no longer abstract. It had tangible, life-altering consequences. And while male inventors often dominate the history books, it's important to remember the contributions of women, too. Figures like Ada Lovelace, who worked with Charles Babbage on early computing concepts, or Mary Anning, a fossil collector whose discoveries advanced paleontology, show that the spirit of innovation was not limited by gender, even if opportunity often was. More broadly, this was a time when the world believed in progress. Exhibitions, like the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London's Crystal Palace, showcased machines, inventions, and marvels from around the world. Millions came to witness the future in glass and steel. Newspapers and periodicals fed the public a steady diet of wonder, new locomotives, new chemical processes, new materials. Each invention seemed to confirm that humanity was on an unstoppable path forward. But there was a shadow to this optimism. As machines grew more powerful, questions emerged. Were jobs being lost to automation? Were cities growing too fast? Was nature being destroyed in the name of innovation? Philosophers and poets voiced unease. Writers like Mary Shelley, in her novel Frankenstein, grappled with the moral responsibilities of science. Progress, it seemed, could be both a gift and a burden. Still, the spirit of the age prevailed. Invention was the heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution, not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of asking, testing, failing, refining, and discovering. It was in the engineer's sketchbook, the chemist's flask, the machinist's hand. It was found in the belief that the world could be made better, faster, cleaner, stronger. It was a revolution not only of steel and smoke, but of ideas. As the 19th century progressed, the torrent of invention unleashed by the Industrial Revolution showed no signs of slowing. If anything, it quickened, spreading from the realm of steam and iron into the subtler, more complex domains of electricity, light, motion, and computation. This was no longer just an age of industry. It was becoming an age of technology, where the invisible forces of nature were harnessed and bent to human will. Electricity, long observed as a natural phenomenon, began to reveal its immense potential. Early discoveries in electrochemistry and magnetism by pioneers like Alessandro Volta, Michael Faraday, and André-Marie Ampère formed the foundation for a coming revolution. Faraday, in particular, demonstrated how magnetic fields could generate electric currents, a principle that led to the creation of the electric dynamo. With this device, mechanical energy could be converted into electrical energy, laying the groundwork for electric power generation. By the late 1800s, inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla brought electricity into everyday life. Edison's development of the incandescent light bulb was more than an invention. It was a symbol. Where gaslight had flickered in factories and city streets, electric light now shone steadily and cleanly. It extended productive hours, improved safety, and made homes feel modern and refined. Tesla, working with alternating current (AC) systems, challenged Edison's direct current (DC) designs in what came to be known as the War of the Currents. Tesla's vision, ultimately victorious, made it possible to transmit electricity over long distances, making centralized power grids feasible. With AC, electric power could light up entire cities, drive motors, and soon change the very rhythm of daily life. This electrical revolution touched every corner of industry. Factories installed electric motors, replacing the belts and shafts powered by steam. Machines became more precise, more reliable, and easier to control. Offices gained electric lighting, and eventually the telegraph, telephone, and typewriter, tools that gave rise to white-collar work and new forms of labor. Electricity, also ignited the transportation revolution's second phase. The electric tram transformed urban mobility. Where once horses pulled carriages through crowded cobblestone streets, now sleek streetcars glided silently along rails, powered by overhead wires. Cities expanded outward. Suburbs took root. Commuting became a daily ritual. As mobility increased, so too did the ambition to go further, faster. Inventors around the world turned their eyes to new forms of motion. The internal combustion engine, first theorized in the early 19th century, became practical with the work of engineers like Nicholas Otto, Gottlieb Daimler, and Carl Benz. Unlike steam engines, these engines used gasoline or diesel fuel, were compact, and could be started and stopped easily. Their portability opened the door to a new era. The automobile was born not in a single moment, but through decades of incremental innovation. Early models were slow, loud, and expensive, but they captivated the public imagination. By the dawn of the 20th century, visionaries like Henry Ford were introducing assembly lines that made cars affordable for the masses. The roads, once trodden by horses and wagons, began to fill with engines. But even the sky could not limit the ambitions of industrial innovators. Inspired by the flight of birds and the lifting power of balloons, human flight became an obsession. In 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright, two brothers from Ohio, made the first powered, controlled airplane flight at Kitty Hawk. It lasted only 12 seconds, but those seconds echoed across time. What had once been myth became machine. The dream of centuries had been realized through calculation, experimentation, and a deep belief in possibility. In parallel, minds turned to computation. Long before silicon chips, engineers and mathematicians imagined machines that could process information. Charles Babbage, often considered the father of the computer, designed the difference engine and later the analytical engine, mechanical devices that could perform complex calculations. Though never fully built in his lifetime, Babbage's designs laid the theoretical groundwork for the computers of the 20th century. His collaborator, Ada Lovelace, envisioned even more. She saw that such a machine could process not just numbers but symbols, and could, in essence, be programmed, a prophetic insight that anticipated the software of today. The scope of invention in the industrial era was astonishing not only in volume but in variety. It touched every domain: textiles, steel, energy, communication, medicine, transportation, and computation. Each discovery, each device, was part of a larger story, a network of ideas and applications that reshaped the material and intellectual world. Innovation became a culture, a mindset. Schools of engineering were founded. Scientific journals proliferated. Expositions and world fairs showcased the latest marvels. There was a shared belief across classes and countries that knowledge could be used to solve problems, enhance comfort, and master the environment. And yet, for all the celebration, this age of invention raised new questions, ethical, philosophical, and existential. Could humanity invent faster than it could understand? Would machines serve mankind or replace it? Was every problem truly solvable? These questions would grow louder in the century to come. But in the quiet shadow of the 19th century's great machines, one truth stood clear. The human mind, once bound by the rhythms of the seasons and the limits of muscle, had entered a new epoch. One powered not just by steam or coal, but by imagination itself. Though the Industrial Revolution began in the damp hills and coalfields of Britain, it did not remain confined to the British Isles. The power of mechanization, the efficiency of mass production, and the promise of profit spread quickly across borders and oceans. What began as a regional transformation soon became a global phenomenon, shaping the destinies of empires, altering trade routes, and redrawing the map of modern life. In Western Europe, the spread of industrialization took root in waves. Belgium was among the first to follow Britain's path. Rich in coal and iron ore, and strategically located between France and Germany, Belgium became a hub of metallurgy and textile production. Towns like Liège and Ghent mirrored the soot-streaked skylines of English cities. The Belgian government, taking lessons from Britain, supported infrastructure development, especially railroads, which quickly connected its industrial centres. France followed, though at a more measured pace. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars had disrupted economic stability, but by the mid-19th century, France's industries, especially in textiles, rail and chemicals, began to surge. Regions like Alsace, Lyon and northern France became powerhouses of silk, cotton and steel. Paris too was transformed, not only as an intellectual and political capital, but as a showcase of modernization with its wide boulevards, new train stations, and gas-lit streets. In Germany, a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities initially slowed development, but when industrialization did arrive, it came with remarkable force. The Ruhr Valley emerged as the industrial heart of Germany, rich in coal and iron, and home to steelworks and armaments factories. The German Zollverein, a customs union, helped unify trade policies and foster economic integration. By the late 19th century, Germany was rivaling Britain in engineering, chemistry, and manufacturing, with firms like Siemens and Krupp leading the way. The United States embraced industrialization with extraordinary speed and scale. With vast natural resources, a growing population, and a culture of innovation, America adapted the European model to its own expansive geography. The Northeast, particularly cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, became centers of textiles, shipping, and finance. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney made cotton king, fueling both northern industry and southern plantations. As railroads stretched westward, they opened vast swathes of land to agriculture, mining, and settlement. Chicago, once a frontier outpost, became a railway hub, and meat-packing capital. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, stitched together the coasts, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and ideas at unprecedented speed. But America's industrial rise came with deep contradictions. While cities boomed and fortunes were made, immigrant labor, often underpaid and overworked, fueled the engine. Children worked in mills. Strikes and labor disputes erupted across the country. Industrial tycoons like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller amassed vast empires of steel and oil, while millions of workers lived on the edge of poverty. Elsewhere, the industrial tide arrived through the twin forces of imperialism and global trade. In India, the British dismantled native industries and reoriented the economy toward raw material extraction, especially cotton, opium, and tea. Indian textiles, once famed across the world, were undercut by British imports, devastating local artisans. Railways were built across the subcontinent, not to serve Indian society, but to transport goods to ports for export. Yet in time, these same railways would become vital arteries for a growing Indian nationalist movement. Japan, by contrast, chose to industrialize deliberately and rapidly. After centuries of isolation, the Meiji Restoration in 1868 launched a nationwide campaign of modernization. The Japanese state imported Western technology, built factories, established a public education system, and sent students abroad to study science and engineering. In just a few decades, Japan emerged as an industrial and military power, proof that modernization need not come at the hands of Western colonizers. Other regions experienced the Industrial Revolution more as an imposition than a choice. In Latin America, economies were reshaped to serve foreign markets. Argentina's cattle industry, Brazil's coffee plantations, and Chile's nitrate mines were integrated into a global system dominated by European and American interests. Railroads were built, not to connect domestic markets, but to move raw materials to ports for export. Local industries remained stunted, their growth overshadowed by dependency on global capital. The Ottoman Empire and Qing China struggled to keep pace. Attempts at modernization were often half-hearted or resisted by entrenched elites. In China, the arrival of British opium and the resulting Opium Wars shattered the nation's sovereignty and opened its ports to foreign powers. Meanwhile, industrial goods from Europe flooded Chinese markets, undermining local artisans. A civilization that had once led the world in innovation found itself reeling from the impact of foreign machines and unequal treaties. Still, the story of global industrialization was not uniform. In each place, it played out differently, shaped by local conditions, cultural values, natural resources, and political choices. But the overarching pattern was clear. The Industrial Revolution was not just a British affair. It was a world-shaping phenomenon, touching every continent, transforming every economy, and challenging every society to adapt or be left behind. At the turn of the 20th century, a new global order was emerging, one in which factories outnumbered farms, machines outpaced muscle, and nations measured power in steel, rail, and coal. The world had become smaller, faster, more connected, and more unequal. As the Industrial Revolution galloped into its mature phase in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it brought with it not only unprecedented technological and economic growth, but also a profound reckoning with the human cost of progress. For all the gleaming railways and humming factories, there were still millions who lived in grinding poverty, whose labor built the new world, but who reaped few of its rewards. At the heart of this reckoning was inequality. The Industrial Revolution had birthed a new social order, one in which wealth was concentrated in the hands of factory owners, industrialists, financiers, and landowners who had embraced mechanized agriculture. These were the captains of industry, and in some views, the robber barons. Their fortunes were vast, their influence unmatched. In cities like London, New York, Berlin, and Paris, opulent mansions stood just miles from squalid tenements. The working class, by contrast, endured long hours, dangerous conditions, and economic insecurity. Though wages had gradually improved from the earliest industrial decades, they remained modest. Healthcare was scarce, pensions non-existent, and injury or illness often spelled disaster for an entire family. Women and children continued to work in many industries, often for a fraction of male wages. This disparity gave rise to a wave of resistance and reform, unlike anything the industrial world had seen before. Labor unions, now increasingly legal and organized, grew in strength and number. In Britain, the Trades Union Congress, TUC, formed in 1868, becoming a powerful voice for worker rights. In the United States, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and later the Industrial Workers of the World, IWWW, championed collective bargaining and direct action. Strikes became a frequent feature of industrial life. Some were small and localized. Others, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 or the Pullman Strike of 1894, shook entire nations. Workers marched in the streets, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair pay. Police and private security forces were often called in to break strikes, sometimes violently. Clashes between labor and capital became defining moments of industrial-era politics. Meanwhile, socialist and anarchist ideologies gained followers. Thinkers like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Emma Goldman, and Rosa Luxemburg offered critiques of capitalism that resonated deeply with the urban poor. In some countries, socialist parties gained parliamentary power, pushing for labor laws, social welfare, and expanded suffrage. In others, revolutions loomed. One of the most significant responses to industrial inequality came in the form of government reform. Public outcry and growing political pressure led to a wave of legislation aimed at improving urban life. Britain passed laws limiting child labour, setting maximum work hours, and improving factory conditions. Germany, under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, introduced the world's first modern welfare state, with health insurance, accident insurance, and pensions for workers. Education reform also took center stage. By the early 20th century, many industrialized nations had instituted mandatory primary education, breaking the cycle of child labor and illiteracy. Schools became not just places of learning, but instruments of social integration and upward mobility. Simultaneously, the arts and literature of the era reflected and challenged the status quo. Writers like Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo, and Émile Zola exposed the hardships of the working poor. Their novels filled with vivid depictions of slums, orphanages, and corrupt institutions stirred the public conscience. Painters, too, began to turn their attention to laborers and urban life, portraying them not as anonymous masses, but as individuals with dignity and struggle. Religious and charitable organizations also played a role in mitigating industrial misery. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, provided aid to the destitute, while urban missions and settlement houses offered food, shelter, and education to those in need. These efforts, though often paternalistic, helped fill the gaps left by governments and markets. By the early 20th century, a new kind of society was emerging, one that had not yet solved the problems of inequality and exploitation, but that had begun to recognize them, confront them, and seek remedies. The Industrial Revolution had created modernity, but it had also forced a reckoning with its costs. The question of how to balance progress with justice, innovation with humanity, would become the defining challenge of the new century, one that we are still grappling with today. As the soot settled and the pistons slowed, as the century turned and the hum of machinery became the new background music of daily life, the world stood forever changed. The Industrial Revolution was not merely a historical phase or a collection of mechanical achievements. It was a profound reshaping of how humans lived, worked, and thought. Its effects echo into our present and will shape our future. At its core, the Industrial Revolution represents the triumph and the trial of human ambition. It demonstrated that with knowledge, persistence, and ingenuity, we could harness nature's forces, scale new heights of production, and radically extend the reach of our hands and minds. It brought forth a material abundance once unimaginable. Steel skyscrapers replaced wooden cottages. Miles of rail replaced lonely roads. The distant corners of the earth came within reach. It also awakened a new human consciousness. For the first time, individuals began to see themselves not simply as members of villages or kingdoms, but as participants in a global system. The tools they used, the clothes they wore, the food they ate, the stories they read, were now often made by people they would never meet, in places they would never see. The world had grown larger and smaller at the same time. Yet alongside that sense of possibility came a reckoning with cost, environmental degradation, labor exploitation, colonial extraction. The Industrial Revolution showed us not only what we could do, but what we might choose to do, and whether we were ready for the power we had unlocked. The same steam that drove trains also darkened skies. The same steel that built bridges also built bullets. Its legacy is thus one of duality, of progress and pain, innovation and inequality, hope and hazard. It gave us factories and child labor, medicine and smog, prosperity and pollution, and it placed before every generation since a central question: how do we balance what we can do with what we should do? We still live in the wake of that revolution. Our smartphones, our cities, our supply chains, they all trace back to decisions made in the forges of the 18th and 19th centuries. The questions of energy, equity, and ethics that challenge us today are not new but deep echoes of the industrial age. And yet, there is reason for optimism. For if that era taught us anything, it is that we are capable of reinventing the world, not once, but continually. That knowledge can overcome ignorance. That connection can overcome division. That invention can serve not only markets, but meaning. As you drift now into sleep, let these thoughts linger like soft embers in the quiet of your mind. The Industrial Revolution was not just a turning of gears or a rise in output. It was the beginning of modern humanity's search for its soul within the steel. It is a story of power and people, of light and shadow, and of the eternal tension between creation and consequence. And so, in your dreams, if you find yourself walking cobbled streets under the glow of gaslight, or standing at the edge of a thundering factory floor, know that you are not merely looking back, but also looking forward toward all the revolutions still to come.